There is a war inside the Vietnam War that for 30 years the United States government insisted had never happened. The men who fought it crossed borders that officially no American ever crossed. They operated in countries the United States was not officially at war with. They suffered casualty rates so high that by some measures they exceeded 100%. And when they died, the cover stories said they had been lost somewhere else, doing something else, because the truth was classified at the highest levels. They were the men of MACV-SOG, and this is the dossier on the secret war America denied for 3 decades. The name itself was a piece of camouflage. MACV-SOG officially stood for the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observation Group. It sounded like a research office, a unit of analysts and paper pushers. It was nothing of the kind. SOG was a top-secret special operations force drawing on the most elite soldiers America had: Green Berets, Navy commandos, Air Force specialists, and its mission was to fight the part of the war that could not be admitted in public. To understand why SOG existed, you have to understand the great problem of the Vietnam War, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was not a single road, but a vast, shifting network of paths, roads, and supply lines that carried North Vietnamese soldiers and weapons south to the battlefields. But the trail did not run straight down through South Vietnam, where American forces could attack it. Instead, it ran through the supposedly neutral neighboring countries of Laos and Cambodia. For political reasons, the United States was not officially fighting in those countries, and so the enemy's most important lifeline ran through a sanctuary the Americans were not allowed to openly touch. SOG's job was to touch it anyway, in secret. Small teams of Americans and their indigenous allies would slip across the borders into Laos and Cambodia, into the heart of enemy territory, to do the things that officially were not being done. They scouted the trail. They tapped into enemy communications. They planted sensors and mines. They snatched prisoners. They called in airstrikes on supply convoys. They rescued downed pilots. And they gathered the intelligence that no one else could reach. They went, deliberately and repeatedly, into the most dangerous ground in Southeast Asia. And they went in tiny numbers, deep behind the lines, with no acknowledgement and often no hope of large-scale rescue. The teams themselves were astonishingly small. A typical reconnaissance team might be just a handful of men, 2 or 3 Americans and a few indigenous fighters, inserted by helicopter into a jungle swarming with thousands of enemy troops. Think about that imbalance. A few men dropped into territory held by an entire enemy army, with the nearest friendly force often a border away. Their survival depended on stealth, on speed, on radio contact, and on the extraordinary courage of the helicopter crews who flew in to pull them out, when again and again a mission was discovered and a tiny team found itself running for its life from hundreds of pursuers. The danger is hard to overstate. Many SOG missions were compromised almost the moment the teams hit the ground. The enemy knew the trail was being watched and hunted for the recon teams relentlessly. A SOG team's life expectancy on a hot mission could be measured in minutes once it was discovered. The records are full of desperate running fights, of teams calling in airstrikes almost on top of their own positions, of helicopter extractions under withering fire, of men hauled out of the jungle on ropes because there was no place to land. The casualty rates were among the highest of any American unit in the entire war. Some of the men who served in SOG ran mission after mission, knowing each time that the odds were stacked brutally against them. And through all of it ran the absolute secrecy. The cross-border missions were classified at the highest levels. The families of men killed in Laos or Cambodia were often told their sons had died elsewhere. The medals earned could not always be openly described. The entire enterprise was buried so deep that for decades after the war ended, the men of SOG could not speak of what they had done. They carried their war in silence, their bravery unrecorded in public, their losses hidden behind cover stories. It was only many years later, as the records were finally declassified, that the full scope of the secret war came to light, and with it, the recognition of just how much these men had endured. What did all that courage and sacrifice achieve? SOG's intelligence on the Ho Chi Minh Trail was invaluable, shaping the air campaign against the enemy supply lines and giving American commanders a picture of the hidden war they could have gotten no other way. The teams disrupted the trail, captured prisoners and documents of enormous value, and tied down enemy forces that had to be diverted to hunt them. In the shadow war along the borders, a few hundred elite men had an impact far out of proportion to their numbers. But there is a harder truth in the SOG story, and it connects to everything else about Vietnam. For all their skill and courage, for all the intelligence they gathered and the damage they did, the secret warriors could not close the trail. The lifeline kept flowing south, and the enemy kept coming. The men of SOG fought brilliantly and bravely in the shadows, and still the larger war ground toward its frustrating end. Their story is, in a sense, the whole American experience in Vietnam in miniature: extraordinary capability and courage applied at terrible cost against an enemy whose determination could absorb it all. The recognition came late, much of it long after the war. As the missions were declassified, the men of SOG finally received some of the honor they had earned in silence, including a disproportionate number of the nation's highest awards for valor, a measure of just how desperate their fighting had been. But for 30 years they had been ghosts, soldiers who fought a war that officially never happened, in countries where they officially never were, on missions their own government denied. So who were the men of MACV-SOG? They were the soldiers of the secret war, the ones who crossed the borders no one would admit existed, who fought and died in the shadows of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, who carried some of the heaviest burdens of the entire conflict and were forbidden to speak of it for a generation. They went into the most dangerous ground in the war in numbers so small it defied reason, and they did it again and again. And the fact that their story was hidden for 30 years makes it, perhaps, the most important file in the entire Vietnam dossier the secret war finally brought into the light. Subscribe to the War Dossier, the stories the history books leave out.